Seeing the homeless was something strange to me growing up. Initially, they scared me. I saw them as a danger to my life and considered them as subhuman. However, with time and experience, I grew wiser and saw the homeless in a different light. I saw them as people whose lives led them to being homeless through several unfortunate circumstances. So, in this video, I will examine those several unfortunate circumstances to illustrate how most of us are closer to being homeless than millionaires. When we think of the homeless, we imagine people wearing tattered clothes living out in the streets. However, it's broader than that. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, homelessness can be defined in many ways. For example, it could be an individual family who lacks an adequate nighttime residence. An individual family with a primary nighttime residence that is a place not designed for use as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings, like a car, park, or abandoned building. An individual family living in a supervised shelter designated to provide temporary living arrangements. An individual family who will immediately lose their housing, including housing they own, rent, live in without paying rent, or are sharing with others. An individual family that has no subsequent residence identified and lacks the resources or support networks needed to obtain other permanent housing. An unoccupied youth who have experienced a long-term period without living independently in permanent housing, have experienced persistent instability, and can be expected to continue in such status for an extended period because of chronic disabilities, chronic physical health or mental health conditions, substance addiction, histories of domestic violence or childhood abuse, and multiple barriers to employment. Although the homeless population is diverse, some subgroups are more likely to find themselves without a place to call home. This risk is significantly tied to gender, race, and ethnicity. Males are far more likely to experience homelessness than their female counterparts. Numerically, white people are the largest racial group within homelessness. However, historically marginalized racial groups are far more likely to experience homelessness because of segregation and discrimination in employment and housing. Not to mention, racial disparity in incarceration rates has also impacted the rates of homelessness. Black and brown people have a higher chance of being targeted, profiled, and arrested for minor offenses, causing them to have a criminal history. And a criminal history can keep people from successfully passing background checks to secure both housing and employment. Outside of racial discrimination, there are factors that affect homelessness as a whole. The lack of affordable housing, the limited scale of housing assistance programs, rising rents, and the stagnant wage growth have contributed to the most severe affordable housing and homelessness crisis in U.S. history. Poor people are unable to pay for housing, food, childcare, and education, so difficult choices are made and housing is cut out because it's the most expensive. Ultimately, this leaves many with a steady job without a home and nowhere to go. So surprisingly, not all homeless are jobless. They're just not earning enough to afford a home. Those struggling to pay rent also have to worry about healthcare because a serious illness or disability can start a downward spiral into homelessness. Those occurrences prevent someone from holding a job. And without a job, you have no means of a steady income. Without a steady income, how are you able to afford somewhere to call home? How are you able to afford something to eat? Then there's those medical bills you have incurred. The consequences of something you never asked for are drastically life-changing. And unfortunately, our healthcare system isn't set up to help people avoid those consequences. Moving on, addiction could be complex and controversial when you pair it with homelessness, because many who are addicted to alcohol and drugs never become homeless. But those who are poor and addicted are clearly at an increased risk of homelessness. Our society has a pre-programmed reaction to addiction. Those who are struggling with substance abuse disorders are condemned and too often ridiculed by the people who are supposed to help them, leading them to being homeless. On the other hand, the relationship between domestic violence and homelessness is simple and undisputed, because a domestic violence experience can be an immediate cause of homelessness. Survivors of domestic violence may turn to homeless service programs, seeking a safe temporary place to stay after fleeing an abusive relationship. However, programs designed to assist survivors are not adequate to handle the rate of those affected, leaving them with nowhere to turn when they escape their abusers, forcing them to call the streets their home. Eradicating homelessness is something that can't be done overnight. However, there are many solutions that could push us closer to it. First is by connecting the homeless to housing. With this, they'll have a platform from which they could address other factors that contributed to their homelessness. For example, those with substance abuse disorders could get treatment without having to worry about living on the streets. This will contribute to long-term recovery and reduce relapses for the homeless. It will take an investment of millions by local governments to provide free housing for those struggling, but that's better than the alternative of criminalizing and forcibly removing the homeless. The solution for those facing obstacles to finding and maintaining employment is additional job training and placement programs. Improving access to supportive services such as childcare subsidies and transportation assistance will go a long way into helping people stay employed and achieve housing stability. For those fleeing domestic violence, the immediate need is safety. With additional financial support through rental assistance, some survivors may be able to safely stay in their own home. This reduces the risk of homelessness, as well as the possibility of future violence. Beyond this, survivors also require supportive services that can help them heal from the trauma of abuse and improve their economic security and well-being. Homelessness can happen to anyone. It can happen in an instant. Rather than criticizing the homeless, try putting yourself in their shoes so that you can understand where they're coming from and why they end up in such dire circumstances, so that you can be part of the solution, not the problem.